Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz.
Hello, and welcome to episode 51 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. Before we raise the curtain on this episode, a quick reminder of our competition that we announced in episode 50, where with the help of theatre tokens, we are giving away 2 prizes of £50 of theatre tokens. The tokens can be used at over 270 venues around the UK, and they have no expiry date. For your chance to win one of the £50 prizes, all you need to do is to identify what the most popular episode of our first 50 released to date has been. Simply email us at plays@theplaypodcast.com with the name of the episode that you believe has been listened to more times than any other. The competition will close at midnight on the 31st of August, 2022, at which point I will randomly select 2 of the correct answers. Good luck, and thank you for supporting the podcast for the first 51 shows. The curtain rises on a hospital waiting room. A young woman, Alice, sits waiting. She has a bloody cut on her leg. A man enters carrying 2 styrofoam cups. He is Dan, who has accompanied Alice to hospital, though they've only just met when Alice was struck by a taxi crossing the road, and he was there to help her. After some minutes, a doctor, Larry, passes through, but stops, his eye caught by the pretty girl. Despite it not being his area of expertise, he stops to chat to Alice. He flirts with her while examining her leg. She bums a cigarette from him before he departs. Alice has only just arrived back from New York, all her belongings contained in the rucksack at her feet. Dan asks her to meet him after work. Instead, Alice tempts him to call in sick and spend the day with her. So begins, in these random encounters, a merry-go-round of metropolitan relationships, powered by sex and betrayal, where partners fall in and out of love in constant search of new stimulation and self-worth. This is Closer by Patrick Marber, which premiered at the National Theatre in 1997. Its clever and candid dissection of the destructive power of sexual desire hit a contemporary nerve that propelled the production into the West End and to Broadway, winning Olivier and New York Critics Circle Awards. Marber also wrote the screenplay for the film of Closer, which was released in 2004-05, directed by Mike Nichols, and starring Clive Owen, Julia Roberts, Jude Law, and Natalie Portman. Closer was Patrick Marber's second play, following the success of Dealer's Choice in 1995. His other titles include Howard Katz, Don Juan in Soho, and The Red Lion, as well as adaptations of Ibsen, Strindberg, and Turgenev. As loyal listeners will know, he is also a director, in which capacity he joined me in episode 33 to talk about Tom Stoppard's majestic play Leopoldstadt, which he directed in the West End. 25 years on from the premiere of Closer, the play is currently being revived in a dazzling production at the Lyric Theatre in Hammersmith in London, directed by Clare Lizzimore. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Clare herself, who is wonderfully placed to help us explore the dangerous liaisons of Closer and to evaluate how it has aged since its striking debut. Welcome, Clare. Thank you for joining me.
Absolute pleasure. I can't wait. I've just finished rehearsals. I've been talking about the play and the production for 6-7 weeks, and now I'm sort of bereft, so I'm thrilled that I get a chance to talk about it again.
Ah, brilliant. Perfect timing. So I must do a proper introduction, though, Clare. Clare Lizzimore is a director and a writer. She was a resident director at the Citizen Theatre in Glasgow and a staff director at the National Theatre, and has directed numerous plays as part of the Royal Court Theatre's international program. More recently, she's directed plays not only at the Royal Court, but at the Arcola, Theatre 503, Hampstead, the Kiln, the Old Fire Station at Oxford, and the Young Vic, where her production of Mike Bartlett's play Bull won an Olivier Award for Outstanding Achievement in an Affiliate Theatre. And that was a wonderful show, one of my favorites. As playwright, Clare has written plays for the Royal Court and the Studio Theatre in Washington, D.C. So that was a very brief synopsis. There are many more credits I could have read out. But in the interest of time, my first question, Clare, is what is it about Closer that drew you to want to direct it personally? And connected to that, why now?
Such a good question. It's because it's completely countercultural. It shouldn't go on now. That everything about our society now is primed to reject the sentiments in the play. Quite rightly, Me Too was an avalanche in the right direction. But I think theatre is a place of truth, should be a place where we tell the truth. However unpalatable those truths are. And this is a play about unpalatable truths, about human beings who behave terribly. At its worst, a criticism you could make of the play is that it's misogynist, but it's not an accident. It's deliberate. Patrick is shining a light onto the worst of human behaviour and sometimes the best of human behaviour. It's complex. It's enormously complex. And I think that's what makes a great play, is a play that can ask questions about humanity that never go away. The play won't ever answer them, but we're compelled to keep putting on the plays that ask these questions because there's something true and essential at the heart of them. And it's about the complexity of being alive. And this play particularly, I think, asks the question about the human being as an animal and dark animalistic truths about risking your morality and risking almost your place in society to pursue love and sex and desire, selfish wants. But yeah, as I say, there's an unpalatable truth there that is compelling.
Yeah. I mean, would you think could it actually have been written now?
No.
We wouldn't be able to actually address the truth in the way he does, because there's no question that these forces of desire and unpalatable behaviors, as you describe them, are still there. They're things perhaps that we repress more, but not to acknowledge them may not be truthful.
I think that's right, but I do think that there's a really interesting question. I don't have the answer for it. It's something to fathom, which is, if the play was put on, I don't think it would be put on now, because I think there would be a feeling that one was giving space and attention to misogyny.
Yeah.
And, maybe fair enough, but, it's a real conundrum. Do you put on work that shows the world as it should be and that we agree with, or do we put on work that we don't agree with and raise those questions? I'm for asking questions and raising uncomfortable questions. I think that's what the theatre is for. But it is a complicated one.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, because what you don't want to fall into is the kind of cancel culture where we're not allowed to actually address issues because you'll be accused of perpetuating some kind of...
Exactly. I think that's the fear.
Some kind of models of behavior. But, you go too far and you end up with censorship and actually, as we've said, hiding some truth or not addressing some truth.
I think the answer in the play is culpability. And I think that was what I was interested in, that they all grieve for their own behaviour and they are all culpable in the fact that a young woman dies within the central narrative of the play. Sorry, spoiler. But they don't get away with that. Their selfish behaviour, their desires, their needs change the course of her life.
Yeah.
And that was something I really wanted to bring up. I wanted to raise Alice's story in this production to sort of acknowledge a feminist take on, well, precisely what Patrick was looking at, really, although it could potentially be buried if you're looking at it in a naturalistic way. But he absolutely knows about culpability because that is the consequence of their actions.
We will get into this because I think there's some large questions about culpability and how much do they actually learn or realize about the impact of their actions. And we'll talk about each of these characters as well. So spoilers you give away. I don't mind spoilers because actually we have to jump into the play itself. What I'd like to do is to give listeners some idea about who the main characters are and what the synopsis of the plot is, so that they can at least follow along if they are not familiar with it. So this may include spoilers, but we're going to launch in. So Claire, could you give us the briefest of possible synopsises of what the play is about and who the characters are?
Well, I think it's about big themes of exploitation and selfishness, rage, blame, lust, love. People who are risking everything for the moment. I think this is what I learnt about Patrick when I went to paying my due diligence to Patrick's work. I read everything, past and present. I asked him to send me all his recent screen work, as well as I, went into library, bookshops, etc. Read all his past catalogue, as well as his current and even future stuff that hasn't been aired yet. Because when I was, starting in British theatre, I did a lot of work observing and training and assisting writers. And one of the writers I assisted was Stephen Jeffries, who had a brilliant, really comprehensive course on playwriting. And one of his theories, which I think is tried and tested actually, is that every playwright, no matter their, the sort of current beat by beat drama and context of their work, they will be pursuing an essential myth or story at the centre of it, something they're always drawn to. And so I tried to work out what Patrick's was, and I figured it. And I said to him, Patrick, I think I know what your central myth is, but if I tell you, will that sort of break you? Like, opening the curtain to The Wizard of Oz.
And did he want to know?
He did. He was fascinated. What is it? And I said, well, your first play was about gambling and risking everything in the moment. And I said, I think actually that is what you're interested in. I think that's the central story and myth of all your work. It's about people gambling, risking, putting all their chips on an ideology or a desire or a moment. And then what will play out will play out. And it's how many chips each person has and how much they're risking as you go through the play. And he said, oh, I think you're right. And then he was going, but what about, oh, no, you're right. Oh, what about, oh, no, that's right. And I think that is the central premise of the play. It's risk and desire and spontaneity versus morality and citizenship. And those two premises sort of are at war throughout the play.
Yeah, and it's largely, of course, about relationships. There are four characters. I'm going to say two couples. They're interchanging couples, two men, two women, and how their relationships as couples unfold and are subject to the stresses of extracurricular desire, for example.
Absolutely.
Or maybe it's just they become complacent, or they're in the relationship for the wrong reason initially. All those sorts of things are explored. But as you say, what's fascinating about it is that they seem to have relationships which on the surface are happy and successful, and yet they have this compulsion to somehow explode them, to destroy them even, to take a risk that could destroy them.
Absolutely, yeah. Passion and anarchy are part of it to such an extent that you can sort of draw parallels to really classic literature. It becomes sort of Jacobean or Shakespearean.
Yeah.
One of my favourite scenes actually is in the second half. The two men finally confront each other because it's Dan essentially who starts this whole swapping quartet of different relationships. He falls in love with Alice, who is very young and, such a glorious conundrum of a character. She describes herself as a waif, but yet she's incredibly streetwise, powerful, but,
vulnerable.
She's vulnerable, but yet she sort of is wiser than all of them.
Yeah.
That's the first scene. And the second scene, the play is about beginnings and endings. So you see the beginning of that relationship, and then you see the beginning of Dan's relationship with Anna, where a year later we immediately see him fall in love with her. And then we're off to a sort of French farce almost of, everybody falling in love with everybody else and swapping. But there's deep, deep anarchy there. It's not a conservative play. And it really, I think, taps into the 90s that it's set in. There was a whole artistic movement in the 90s called the sensationalist movement. And it was about pushing boundaries of form and context and
looking for and creating sensational experience, presumably.
Absolutely. And I think this play is absolutely part of that sensationalist movement. There are boundaries which we exist in normal life, but the play, it never settles. It never looks at what happens when it only looks at the most dramatic, most tortuous, heightened experiences of the beginnings and endings of these relationships.
I was going to ask you about the structure in that way, actually, because it consists of 12 scenes spread over 4.5 years of elapsed time. And the timescale for the time between the scenes is set out very specifically, in fact, in a note by Patrick that prefaces the published text. But he also includes a note saying that these are for information only and should not be included in any production program or design. So as we're watching it, we don't know exactly what the chronology is. And I wondered what you thought the effect and intent of the play being structured this way, of 12 scenes over an extended period of time with varying intervals as a series of snapshots, so to speak, is.
Yeah, well, they're almost like 12 different plays when you direct them. So on first viewing, the play beat by beat reads, the dialogue is so fantastic, it reads very naturalistic. But when you're working on it, you realise it isn't. Not to be disparaging at all to the Spice Girls, but Patrick was very keen when he first met me to say, this is written before the Spice Girls phenomenon, which was a completely different kind of feminism, much more overt and sort of brave, bold. And in that context, you could read the beginning of the play as quite bantery. But actually, if you go back to a time before that kind of feminism, it's much more direct. People really are talking and listening to each other, really asking questions. They're not mocking each other and they're not overtly flirting. It's all subtext, it's all under the surface. And as soon as you realise that, then you think, there's the different forms happening underneath this play. So each scene operates in a completely different way. So the first scene is almost like a trial of honour. Who are you? And, what's your worth? Alice is almost saying to Dan, are you as charming as these beautiful little sandwiches I've found in your bag that have their crusts cut off? Are you a charming man who is going to be safe? And, I can take this rucksack and my roaming sensibility and trust you. By the time you get to the third scene, you're in a sort of farcical internet scene. And as you go through, you've got things like French farce and Jacobean tragedy, and almost parallels to Romeo and Juliet by the time you get into the 11th scene. They all have completely different structural principles underneath them, but they all need to feel the same. So that was a wonderful challenge of rehearsals is, how do you buy into and plug into the deep psychological drama and the sensual heightened feelings these people have for each other, but also then honour the ever-changing formal dynamic of the structure of each of these scenes.
Yes, and also, together they add up to something that makes sense in terms of some linear plot or narrative. It's interesting you say that about each scene, because I read that he wanted each scene to have its own depth charge, as he put it, that they would stand on their own in that sense. There'd be something striking and eventful in each scene. And rather than, of course, a strict linear cause and effect, as we've discussed, the impact becomes a cumulative one.
Yes.
In a sense of this series of things.
It does. And not just through sort of story or narrative beats. Like, as I was thinking about the 90s, I did a little poll of some of my colleagues. We were these 90s children. And, if you could sum it up in one word, what would the 90s be? There were things like excess, freedom, debauchery, recklessness, apolitical, nihilism. And you build a picture of this time that felt, it's just normal. We're just growing up in this time frame. But then when you look at it like that and you think, oh gosh, none of these things exist in our current time frame. But the play is written within that context, and almost every single one of those scenes have those senses within them, even if the scene itself is just two people having a cup of tea with each other.
As you said all those things, the word anarchy came back into my mind as you've used several times. It feels pretty anarchic, those sort of times, those sort of behaviors, doesn't it? And the fact that these are varying tones to these scenes and styles, it's like we're trying something different each time. We're looking for something new and exciting, and we're trying on something new, which is what the characters do, of course. They're always looking, I guess, for some new experience that propels them on to take these risks.
Absolutely. And I think one never knows where that's going to go. So I remember reading this play as I was beginning as a director. I couldn't really afford to work in theatre, and I took a job in a flagship branch of a high street brand. And I had just launched a show that had got 5-star reviews, and I was really proud of it. And I thought, this is the beginning of my career. And then nothing happened, because it takes a while. So simultaneously, I was at the beginning of my career and almost felt like I was at the end of my career because nothing was happening. So I went to work for this clothes shop on Tottenham Court Road. And in my lunch breaks, I would run to Foyle's bookshop on Charing Cross Road that houses this, enormous play collection. And that's how I discovered Closer. I would read a scene and then I'd sort of race back.
So you're saying you didn't buy the book? You just went in and read a scene and ran out? Okay.
Well, I did eventually. I did. I said to Patrick, this story's going to come out, and I did eventually buy it. So,
I've seen many of you in my bookshop at Samuel French when I ran Samuel French.
Did you?
Yeah. So all those people like you, wannabe playwrights and actors, sitting on the floor, reading the plays and not buying them and going up. But that was fine.
That's right.
That was fine.
We do eventually. I promise. We pay you back eventually.
It comes round. You write the play and then we publish the play and license the play. So,
Exactly. That's absolutely brilliant. I didn't know that. Yes. So, yeah, I was one of those who was just sort of gobbling up this play. And initially you read it and you think, okay, this is a play about Alice and Dan. And then, if you have to sort of scurry away and go to work and come back the next day, the betrayal is enormous because you come back and Dan's now getting together with Anna. What on earth is... I've just invested in that other relationship, in this other scenario. And that is what the play wants you to feel as an audience. You invest in one relationship so fully, just like the characters are. And then when you come back, seconds later, which is actually a year later, and this betrayal is happening, it wants you to buy into the passion and the emotion of this new encounter. But it also wants you to go, hang on a minute, literally 2 seconds ago, aka a year ago, you've just seen this happening previously. So, it wears that really strongly, that it wants that level of shock. And as I say, sort of culpability of, what happens when people lie to each other. And I always saw it as a sort of bear pit of emotion, that you essentially just, mostly for the play, it's two sets of people highly charged either with rage or desire. And everything else is a frame to allow that dynamic, really.
You were just saying that. It reminded me when you directed Bull, which was set in a boxing ring. These scenes are almost like that. These rounds largely between two people and short lines of dialogue. They're punching at each other. They're evading each other, defensive with each other. They're tearing into each other. It's pretty relentless and brutal at times. And also that point you made about the timings earlier was that you really don't see the good times in between. So they enter into these relationships, and presumably there are some happy times. But Patrick lets time go by to a point where we don't see very many of the good times. We see only moments of crisis.
Yes, I think that was really important that, again, when you greet a play for the first time, one has to write down your hunches, your sort of gut instincts. And even though I'd read it previously and completely adored it, I read it again and I thought, well, actually, the first 3 scenes are actually incredibly funny. And Patrick, back in the day, was a stand-up comedian. He has comedy in his bones. So although he's looking at something that is quite the dark side of human behaviour, at least the first 4 scenes are comedic. And also then it made me think, this is sort of how the production concept came about, is, if you think about what love or desire provokes in one, it is a sort of whirlwind of complicated things, including silliness and fun. And so I knew that somewhere in there, I had to honour that. So there is a scene in a hotel room in the second half where you see Dan and Alice at their very best. And so I began that scene with a sort of homage to Pulp Fiction, with them dancing and being incredibly silly. And hopefully, it's joyful and wonderful because suddenly you see the stuff they're fighting for, the gloriousness of love and connection. And they had such fun doing it because they're doing that wonderful thing where they're riffing off, how much do you remember about when we met? And, what colour were the chairs and what was in my sandwiches?
But all of which makes it even more shocking because, spoilers alert here, that, this is towards the very end of the play. And in fact, the scene also includes a breakup.
It does.
But you're talking about the humor. I agree with you. The internet chat room scene, the 2 men are online, and this is the very early days of the internet, remember? And Larry's entered a sex chat room, and Dan is in there pretending to be a woman.
Yes.
He calls himself Anna, and he basically sends him up. And that is incredibly funny. But these multiple scenes thematically represents the changing and fickle nature of their desires and relationships, of course, in itself. And as we said, time also passes really quickly, so it somehow gives us a sense that these things happen in our lives relatively quickly, and that when we think about our relationships and our lives, they really are a series of highlights, aren't they? If you think about what your relationship consists of, you will think of those moments when you first met and the ones where you broke up potentially as well. So I think that's a very true reflection, isn't it?
I agree. And it is like a series of Polaroids or snapshots that, he's right. When you think of the most heightened moments of your lives, you have a snapshot. There's a smell that will take you back there, or a sensation or a picture or something, but they are snapshots, which is so very clever because he allows us within a few pages to completely see the moment people fall in love with each other. And the second scene for me, where Dan and Anna get together, I always thought on the page, how on earth does that happen? It is absolutely, within a page they're kissing, and how is this a sort of fictionalized version of people getting together? But when you really analyze it, when you work on it, the sort of beat by beat intentions of what's happening, all of us were gobsmacked. We were, oh no, it happens. There's a reason for it happening, and it's beat by beat in every single line. There's a progression. And you realise when you work on the play, Patrick is always 2 steps, or 2, 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. He just seems to completely understand human behaviour, even if you look at it at first sight, you think, well, this is far too quick. In real life, these things happen much more gentle, meandering. But actually, when you look at it dramatically, oh, no, it does make sense.
There are 2 reasons why I think that's true. One is the power of sexual attraction, which is immediate and can be incredibly powerful. And the second thing is the predisposition of people before they come to meet each other, right? So we could assume, for example, that Dan may be unhappy in his relationship, unfulfilled.
Absolutely.
And is looking for something.
Yeah.
And bang, there she is.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit more about each of these characters now.
Yes.
We'll just do it in order in which they appear. Starting with Alice, therefore. I'm going to be somewhat provocative here,
yeah,
Claire.
I'm used to it. It's okay.
Great. My daughter, who saw the show with me at the interval, suggested that Alice could only have been written by a man.
Interesting.
The way that she is conceived as this combination of sexually precocious as well as vulnerable, is she some kind of male cliche?
Well, interestingly, there is a film trope along the lines of the young character in Leon, played by Natalie Portman, actually. There are these sort of characters that were coined as something called manic pixie princess, which was this trope that is not real, of women who are all of the things Alice are: vulnerable yet spiky, emotionally sort of accessible but incredibly tough and streetwise. All these sort of contradictions, also beautiful, ethereal, but also quite punk. And when you say that, one goes to the recent 20 years of film history and you go, oh yeah, I know who that is. I know what that character is. It didn't exist before this play, so potentially Patrick made it up. And it is a theatrical conceit, but importantly, he's very, very honest in saying she made herself up.
Yes.
As in, this young woman, this young character, is given integrity and power to be a chameleon and to constantly change herself. So it's not that he is unaware. It's not that he is creating a character out of white, middle class, 30-something lust or desire. It's not, again, with this play, you can mistake it for accidental. And nothing is accidental. It's completely contrived. She is written like that, but she's also given the power within the character itself that she creates herself. You never really know who she is, actually.
No, and they don't, do they?
No one does.
There's mystery all over the place about some of the stories she tells about her past. There are conflicting stories going on through the play. She has this scar on her leg. One of the stories is that she was in a car accident where her parents were killed and she suffered the cut at that point. But then Larry suggests it might be self-inflicted. And again, spoiler, she even makes up her name.
She does.
Alice is not her real name. We don't know much about her past. We have a sense she has a disturbed past and she's had a dramatic life because Dan steals the background of her life to put into his first and only novel. So therefore, we have that kind of trope. Is she damaged from some things that have gone on in her past, the loss of her parents or something else? But also sexually confident, streetwise, she's been on her own. And one of the things you were saying earlier about when she meets Dan in the first scene, you're thinking, well, part of it might be just survival. I need somebody to latch onto. I'm here all by myself.
Absolutely.
With just a rucksack and nowhere else to go.
And I talked a lot about that with the actress who, we as feminists talked about this a lot. this idea that this character is potentially playing into a lot of, I don't know, sort of desirous territory of how men potentially would want women to be, and that kind of woman doesn't really exist.
Well, I mean, that's writ large, of course, in the fact that she's a stripper. And these scenes, she is in the strip club and stripping. That's very hard, I think, for young women to do as actresses and for us to watch, isn't it?
Very, very hard. We talked about it as who is underneath this. She reveals ultimately that her name is Jane Jones. And is this just a survival of the fittest? Is this actually the most powerful character in the play, who has just got them all round her little finger, really? She knows what men want, so she makes it up. She contrives it, and she just keeps on, changing wigs, changing costumes, and changing her life story and her backstory. Also, I think I studied film as well as theatre, and it's really interesting when you look at artists' work, when they are trying to tell you something visually as well as verbally. And Patrick includes within the work photography, a sense of imagery and capturing framing, and also with all the wigs and all the putting on of pretenses in a sort of almost Shakespearean disguise kind of a way, mirrors and reflection, all these things are included. And again, so it's not an accident. He's constructing a young woman who powerfully knows what people want. So we actually saw it as quite a feminist take on this wonderfully glorious manipulation of a young woman who wants to be in love and is trying to be, and knows that she has the power to have people fall in love with her. So she's just trying it out on a few different people and seeing how it works. She gets burnt because she does end up falling in love with Dan and trusts him, and that is the ultimate price, is that he betrays her.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, because she literally says, I know what men want. And we see, as you said earlier, I think, a certain maturity in her, especially at the very end, where she has certainly learned something. There's a neat connection between the start, where she talks about how when she falls out of love with someone, she just leaves.
Yeah.
And Dan asks her, have you never left someone you've been in love with? And she says, no, you don't leave when you're in love with someone.
Yeah.
And in the end, she does. She actually does that because she is in love with Dan. But she has grown up enough in some ways, mature enough to realize that Dan isn't worth it. His behavior has been so predictable. He's taunting her, trying to find out whether she has slept with Larry, has betrayed him and can't leave it alone. And she just thinks this is pathetic and ultimately beneath her, and loses respect for him.
Absolutely.
And even though she knows this is going to make her unhappy, she actually has the integrity to say, no, I'm going.
She is the moral centre of the play, really. She doesn't cheat on anybody. She doesn't put a foot wrong. Everybody else betrays and, tries to sort of wheedle people back. But she absolutely knows her mind. And almost she's the moral centre, and through her we should experience the betrayal. But yes, I agree with your daughter that, she is a character that doesn't exist, but she self-consciously makes herself up.
Yeah. So here's a question. Given the background of what you're suggesting about her mental stability, and even the beginning of the play, when she literally walks out without looking in front of the taxi, and then at the very end, spoiler again, we learn that she's been run over and killed in New York. And her line is, I never look where I'm going.
Yes.
Okay, that can be a metaphoric statement of some kind, but actually, surely there must be some question as to whether she's deliberately walked out in front of any of these vehicles. I mean, it's ambiguous, but what do you think?
No, I think we're supposed to think that she's sort of a spirit of life, that she's go-getting, and she absolutely grabs life by the horns and is...
Cavalier, just not paying enough attention.
Cavalier, powerful, and breaks all the rules. And no, they're...
Okay, fair enough. I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah.
Let's come to the men next. It has to be said that this doesn't turn out to be a very positive portrait of men in general, does it? They are incredibly self-centered and selfish and crude and cruel. And I think the word, again, my daughter used was insufferable. And as Anna says, men are crap. So let's start with Dan. What do you think about Dan? Is he crap?
No, I think they are all equally. I can't remember the poet who said, "We're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." They're all in the gutter together. They all make mistakes. They all have desire. They all have unpalatable truths. I think what's brave about the depiction of the men is that they are equally balanced with their moments of romanticism and and blind faith and trust and love and
you don't see very much of the good behavior here, though, Claire. Come on. I mean, they're unfaithful and possessive, and
no, you don't.
that may be true, but it's not necessarily admirable.
No, they are definitely not admirable people, but I think both men and women in the play are equally culpable in their terms of their lies and deceit and risking of the moment.
Other than Alice, perhaps.
Yeah, but again, she does lie. She lies all the way through. So although she doesn't cheat, she certainly doesn't tell the truth. But yeah, I mean, they're terrible. They're despicable. But again, they also say the most romantic, charming things. They have their own emotions. They cry. They feel guilty. There's penance. So what the play does is it really goes hard in on showing the worst of these people deliberately in the first half. And then in the second half, there are some really interesting corners that say these aren't just caricature, brutish, hideous people. These are real, complex people who have made hideous mistakes, and they're totally aware of it, and they grieve and they have shame and guilt.
Yes, but I would argue that I'm not sure how much they actually learn. I think is it Larry who says we learn things, but we never change. And we see, I think, far too much of that. And, Dan, coming back to Dan, I mean, Dan's, I suppose, in essence, he's quite weak. Initially he's pretty weak. It's almost like Alice helps to bolster him, the relationship.
Definitely.
And gives him courage to, ironically, to go after Anna.
Absolutely. He's like a succubus. He sort of takes all her... He's a bit of a sort of charming geek. He's with Ruth at the beginning of the play. He's sort of hasn't got a lust for life at all. Alice encounters him, and from her he learns courage and charm and a sense of his own sexuality and power, and then becomes something other than what he was, and uses that charm and that sense of joy and confidence to then seduce somebody else. No, they are all despicable. I'm not wheedling out of the fact that these are versions of people who are behaving at their very baddest.
Well, and Dan, you see the same about Dan being weak. I mean, he doesn't rise above staying in the same job, writing the obituaries in the newspaper. The only time out is he writes this novel, but he essentially steals the story from Alice's life. And then when Larry asks him if he's writing anything else, he says, I haven't got a subject, I can't think of anything. And Larry goes, come on, there's a whole of human life out there. What's wrong with you? So he hasn't even got the imagination to do that.
Absolutely.
And of course, he breaks down when he's in that confrontation with Larry. So you see, I think that weakness is evident. But Larry himself, so what about Larry? He's pretty unreconstructed, kind of boorish. I think my daughter again would have said he was the most loathsome of them all. And that certainly in Sam's portrayal was pretty loathsome, brilliantly done. He's sexually rapacious and I think seems to learn the least, does he, through the whole play?
Does he? I mean, if we look at it in terms of his actions, so he's a sort of lower middle class doctor. We had actually consultants in for all of the roles. So we had a consultant doctor in who was training in London in the 90s, about the same age as Larry, and was absolutely fascinating. I mean, if this was just a microcosm of how things have changed since then, certainly the training of doctors and things they got away with. I mean, this is a whole other podcast, but my word. The whole mechanism of how one would get to be a doctor was completely different. So actually in the 90s, the scope was far broader, and you would be able, if you were lower middle class without much wealth, to be able to train and become a doctor. So Larry is lower middle class. His father's a taxi driver. He's worked his way up. He's got a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but for good reason, that he's worked his way up. But there are these snobs and rich people and people who've been afforded other paths in life around him. He's got together with Anna, who is an artist, a slightly different class bracket. He's got shame and guilt already. He says, do your parents think I'm beneath you? Yeah.
And he says the queen can kiss a frog. So he feels like he's lucked out there.
Exactly. Yeah, totally lucked out. She is really sophisticated, and he is, as he says, a caveman. He, lives by his wits, but yet, he's worked his way up. He's sustaining a really difficult job in the middle of London City. He's a guy who likes sex. He goes on the internet and pursues that, thinks it's consensual, is sort of, amazed by this new scenario where instantly people can be so almost sort of revoltingly sexual. Pursues it. He's allowed to. He's been given consent. Meet me at the
aquarium, yeah.
He goes to the place he's told, charms the woman who ends up being there.
He has a certain confidence and arrogance, maybe even, that comes from almost donning the white coat, that, the position a doctor finds himself in gives him that kind of power as well.
Yeah. And, he's charming and he is kind.
It says that many times. I find very little evidence, but that's fine. The other characters say it.
But so far, what's he done wrong? Nothing. So far, literally, in this scenario, he's pursued a sexual relationship online, which he thinks is consensual. Then we get him at the, Anna's sort of opening of her photography. He comes on to the young lady a little bit, flirts with her, but she flirts with him. And then where do we find him next? Being betrayed by his wife.
Sleeping with the prostitute in New York, but that's just again.
Okay, there we go. He does that. That is his bad. So that is the first thing we come across, which is like, holy shit, okay, you are culpable. You have betrayed your wife. This is inexcusable. And in the same moment, she then basically says, but I've been doing that for a year.
Yeah. But then when he's been wronged, he goes after Alice, partly to have a go at Dan, potentially.
Yeah, exactly. So that's his setup. So his setup is fairly hardworking, average sort of Joe, into sex. He's not done anything wrong. Everything's consensual. And then he's betrayed. And then holy godfire, he unleashes a wealth of rage and spite on a sort of Greek level, where you do think, holy shit, this man really is a caveman. But interestingly, he sleeps with this prostitute in New York and he cries and he says, it was a mistake. I wanted sex. I had to tell you because I love you. And that is the prompting, that's the inciting incident where Anna feels so guilty because he literally just did it. And he's telling her because he loves her, because he can't lie to her. And that's when she says, but I now have to reveal to you that even though I love you, I can lie to you. And actually, I've been lying to you for a year. So I'm not saying anyone sort of comes off better or worse, but yeah, they certainly behave badly. But I think there's an attempt within the play to say this sort of could be anyone. This isn't a cross-section of the worst of society. This is a cross-section of a portion of society.
I agree with that. Because I think actually there's a moment where he talks to Alice about if a woman could see the whole movies, as he describes it, that are inside a man's head, they would be horrified.
Yeah.
And this, stands for not just him. Clearly, this is, some question about sexual drive and desires in animalistic terms, as you said at the very beginning. As he puts it, the whole movies of sex and imagery that slop around through our minds every day.
It's a great quote.
Pretty revealing and very sexualized. And he says, you give us, when he's talking about those images, like Alice at the strip club, you give us imagery and we do with it what we will. And we'll come back to that in a minute, but I wanted to talk about Anna just to get through all four of them. In a way, she seems in many ways the most mature and perceptive, possibly even wise. She's elegant.
Very much so.
But she also feels like the most elusive character because given her intelligence, why does she make the mistakes she makes? Why does she get embroiled in these things? She's already been married and had a failed marriage before, so you'd have thought she'd be more hesitant.
I think that's key. If you're, as I think Patrick very beautifully does, he's not tapping into logic, he's tapping into raw emotion. And so she is the age she is. And the key heartbreak, I suppose, in the play is that Anna is the age she is, sort of mid-30s, and Alice is young 20s. And they each want what the other is, but never the twain will meet. And she is almost forced into this situation because she wants children. And so from my own perspective, you can get quite far into your coming up to your 30s and go, come on, guy, where are you? Where are the goodies? Where are the good ones? I mean, luckily I found one, but I think that is why she gets embroiled, is because she has an internal mechanism and desire, which is, she wants to settle down. She wants them to be good.
One of the most amazing twists in the narrative, beautifully done the way Patrick structures this, is that she is having an affair with Dan while Dan is still with Alice. But in the middle of that affair, she marries Larry and yet continues this affair.
Yeah, she does.
How she came to the decision to marry Larry while having an affair with Dan, who she must be in love with and certainly sexually attracted to. Why does she do that? And I guess some of the answers are you've just given, but it seems so surprising that she would choose to marry Larry when she's in the intensity of this affair with Dan.
I think she does love Larry. I think, if you only listen to the dialogue in terms of its rhythm, like a drum beat, those two, when they talk, it's they connect on a level that is so wonderfully fun and glorious. There is something about those two that they just click, and they have a dynamic in their dialogue, which for whatever rhyme or reason, they connect, they get on. There's love there, and there's a sort of acceptance. But she is still sexually attracted to Dan. I mean, it's complicated.
Wonderfully complicated, which is what life is. So this is great. You said some of the things you said earlier, that Larry is kind, devoted to her, represents certainly a more secure option for what she wants if she wants children and family and that security.
Yeah, I mean, he's a doctor. He's not a failed playwright, poet, etc., arbitrist.
That's true. Though she's also has her own insecurity. I mean, she may think she's to blame for their first failed marriage in some way. I don't know.
I think so.
But at one point, Larry says when she's leaving, you deserve to be happy. You don't think you deserve to be, but you do. And why does she not think she deserves to be happy? There's something in that. There's an insecurity she carries there. Even when she's leaving, Larry says to her, we're happy, aren't we? And she says, yes. And you're thinking, what are you doing? So, again, it all seems relatively self-destructive, some of this, doesn't it?
But isn't that the truth? But, I wrote down a set of questions for myself when I started looking at this play. Are we selfish as a species? Are we? Yes. Are we misogynist? Yes. Would we get away with a whole lot more if there were no consequences? Yes. But equally, isn't the world perennially, for every single person in it, loud and full of bullshit and hard graft and full of injustice? Yes. What makes that better? Not being alone. Connection. Would we do anything to find that connection? Yes. What about who we hurt on the way? Not sure.
Yeah.
That's what the play's about.
And actually, at its root, the play is steeped in sex. It seems to be a pretty obsessive, dominant force in their existence. And as I was saying, a destructive force, perhaps. Larry says pleasure and self-destruction, a perfect poison. He's talking about smoking, actually, but he could be talking about sex.
Yeah, true.
And at base, is it all come from sexual desire being selfish? But that leads to questions of sex and love and the connection between them, or the disjunct between them, which seems a running theme as well, because they try and separate these things. Some of them say to each other, it was only sex. But at the other times, you're saying, when we make love, you don't kiss me. Anna says to Dan, why don't you like it when I say you love you? They don't seem to be able to come up with a successful balance where those things are conjoined.
And that's why I think, in a way, none of them are full of rage at the end of the play. They accept that they were not each other's the one, and they go off in separate directions. And one gets the impression that whatever Alice has meant to them, she's brought them to this place of understanding and sort of wisdom where you bloody hope they go and get it better the next time. But actually, I think the play isn't really interested in those particular 4, or say 3 at the end, learning. I think it's saying how much of us still isn't actually evolved to operate in society and civilized society within the rules and structures that make us moral. Is there still a bit of us that is still raw animal, and we're struggling as a species because we're in constant conflict with these desires and unpalatable truths? I think the play has a higher aim than just these 4 conduits, these 4 wonderfully complicated conduits who we meet. I think it is desperately seeking to put these big questions on the table. I was talking to a director friend of mine, and I was saying to him about this play, why I thought it was important. And we were talking about, well, in a scorched earth territory, what would still be important? What would we still be doing? If the earth was literally scorched, people would still have love and desire. I mean, this would literally be on the agenda. The first thing, safety, protection, connection, attraction.
Repopulate.
Exactly. And it's almost one of the most important questions. In fact, one of the things that moved me so incredibly whilst I was doing my prep for this was the couple who married on the front line in the Ukraine. They took their wedding vows. They just went ahead and, with war surrounding them, they pledged their love and their life to each other. I just wept.
I see all that, but there seems to be a real disjunct between the sexual compulsions and those ideas of companionship and love. And in fact, they are definitely set against each other. I mean, Larry says at one stage, you don't understand about love requires compromise, and the drives seem to be very destructive. And as you said, the animalistic behaviors that are on show, the kind of competitiveness between the men, for example, where they literally almost fight between them over the women and their jealousy. There's some very base instincts at work there.
I agree. I think that's what it's looking at. It's primarily a play about sex, where the couples who get together don't ultimately have very satisfying sex, it seems. And that turns to sort of rage but there's real incompatibility. They may love each other, but they don't have the best sex, so then they look elsewhere, but then the love isn't there, and so henceforth they go round and round in circles. It's quite sort of unblinking in that respect.
Yeah, and the way pornography, or the imagery that I touched on earlier, informs the men's attitudes to sex and the language they use, which is incredibly graphic in the play. And their competitiveness, I said earlier, they're always trying to measure themselves. Who is better? They're literally asking who is better, as if sex can be measured, primarily in the terms of whether or not they can make the woman orgasm. And then there's that wonderful speech from Anna as a riposte where she says, "You don't make me come, I come. You're in the area providing valiant assistance."
Oh, yeah, I love this, yeah.
Which is, touche, and the audience loved that one.
It's wonderful, isn't it? Which is actually, for all we're talking about, actually, there's a version where you can completely see this as a feminist play. The women are heroines. They are wise. They are searching. They're culpable in that they go into these relationships completely, fully aware. They cheat with awareness. And, they do put up with an enormous amount of this hideous language. But I don't know, I just think it's true.
Definitely true. They're let down by the men quite a lot, you'd have to say.
They are, but I have to say, I know Larry is perennially, he says he's a caveman. He is a caveman. But actually, he sleeps with a prostitute in New York. That's unforgivable.
But hey, let's cut to the chase in the end. He leaves Anna. I mean, why in God's name he would do that? It's his choice.
Well, I suppose because she's cheated on him for a year and he just can't get over it.
But they came back together and he wanted her back and, lords it over Dan that he has her back, and you think, fine. And actually, I watched the film this week. Am I right in saying the ending of the film, Anna and Larry are still together?
Yeah.
I just didn't agree with that at all. In terms of what this ending represents, the fact that they are separated again and he's moved on in the play to a younger nurse, I mean, doesn't that say more than their being together?
Definitely. I agree with you. I think there's the idea that some people never change and can't change and won't change, and it's just far too much hard work. And actually, interestingly, about hard work with one's own psychology, this idea of the ability to change and mindfulness, none of that was accessible, talked about, or even a thing in the 90s. So, gloriously, actually, we are now in a society where we can talk about change and the tools and mechanisms to be able to do that. And also all the wonderful just ideas of being able to communicate through therapists or just through a language that we allow ourselves. We just have so much access and understanding to our own psyche now, which potentially could save all these wonderfully complex characters. And that makes me think that we definitely owe it to society to talk about these things, because they are just true, and the play is important in terms of looking at a complexity of masculinity and femininity that isn't straight-lined, and that we have to look at and talk about and not repress.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you've hit spot on there is that these characters have a difficulty understanding themselves. I mean, the women are better at it, but the men in particular, I suppose. So what you're saying about the ability now, or the allowance to be able to look into ourselves and ask ourselves what we're doing and why and how we might improve that and how we learn, as it says in the play, everyone learns but nobody changes. I think that is one of the messages, that you have to learn from this and change.
Absolutely. I think that's right. There was a filmmaker who, one of the reviews was said, you go to a film like that made by this person and it's like they throw dust up in the air and those are all the questions, and then they close the film and you walk out of the cinema just before the dust has settled, and that is the mark of a great piece of work. And actually what you're saying is, now you collect all of that and you ask those questions of yourself. That's the most important thing a play or a piece of art can do, is throw all of this up in the air and then go, okay, you catch now. You catch this dust and then you go and work out what you think. So I completely agree with you about the men being sort of hideous, and everything your daughter said is true. But the play deliberately is going there in order to throw all of this up in the air and go, okay, so how far have we come since the 90s? Have we come any further forward in the dynamic between men and women, the dynamic between ourselves and our self-understanding?
Yeah, so when you throw this dust up in the air, and if you look very specifically at where this play ends, we discovered in Alice's case that her real name was Jane, and she's taken the name from this monument in the park. And the memorials are in the remembrance of people who've died helping or saving someone else. And Alice Ayres is one of those who died saving 3 children from a burning house. So, I mean, I think it's a pretty simple symbol to suggest that perhaps acting selflessly, by contrast to these characters who've been selfish throughout, is one of the things they might learn. I was going to ask you 2 questions, though. One is this play about these characters a time of life, their 20s, their 30s?
100%.
And then also connected to that, is it of its time, is where we started. But let's start with the in their 20s or 30s, because, you know, the age I've got to, I look back at some points and I'm going, oh my God, how self-indulgent are you? Get on with it. What are you doing?
Yeah. But also, you know, I'm also looking back thinking, God, I didn't live enough. Oh my word. If only I could have lived like that, with full of unadulterated.
You would have had much more pain.
So much more fun. I don't know. I was so committed to my theatre career.
It's turned out well, Claire. But yeah, the 20s and 30s. Does this speak to other people? It reminded me, actually, I have to say, again, at my age, reading the novels of Sally Rooney recently, thinking, again, okay, I really admire what she does.
Yes.
But I'm going, that's not my life anymore. This is a certain stage of life.
Definitely.
Where these people are uncertain about what their futures are. They strive for certain things. They seem to achieve some of them. And then, as I said earlier, they still think that's not it. I don't want to be fixed at this age.
Yeah.
I got to find more adventure. I'm going to throw this all away and follow something else.
And isn't that kind of glorious in a way? You know, it's interesting, actually. I hear what your daughter is saying completely. Morally, she's totally astute and is right. You know, there's a little bit of this 90s thing about risk and the pursuit of happiness and, I don't know, the kind of rage, aliveness of living. When we didn't have cameras and things to record our mistakes, everything was private. Every risk, every failure was inherently our own. And it meant that we could be completely despicable, but everybody else was being. I don't mean that, you know, in a flippant way. I just mean that there was a sort of lust, you know, and even there was the song, wasn't there, Lust for Life.
But at what cost to others, though?
Well, this is what I have written down. Absolutely. The whole thing is about risk, who's going to blink first, the pursuit of happiness, and what is the cost, how hard we're working, how hard these people are working to change the other person, but at what cost? Absolutely. And that's humanity, isn't it? All over. That's the perennial question, is what's the cost to other people?
Well, you know, these characters, it seems to me, they're behaving selfishly. They're imposing themselves on their partners a lot of the time. It's not necessarily listening to what the other partner's wanting or needing. And, you know, it's interesting where you started from, because you've obviously done wonderful research and thought about the differences in our social time and our attitudes that have changed in the interim. And my daughter is a living example of that, because her responses, as we've understood here, indicate that she comes at life with a moral framework which is extraordinary.
So good.
That didn't exist when we were in our 20s.
No.
You know, we didn't have the terms of that to define that framework.
didn't have the terms and also didn't have the tools in order to sustain one's own sense of self-worth, self-esteem. And if that was ever rocking, the tools to shore that up, to keep being good in the world, to face off against others who perhaps were being bad or treating us badly. There was no language for dissent or escape or come up. You sort of had to live with it. There's no doubt we've come a million miles in the right direction.
So going back to the very beginning about you putting on this play with all of this bad behavior, dated behavior on display, is it still going to speak to us now then? What are we to take away?
Oh, I think 100%. That's why I did it, really, is that I'm sure we are as passionate and full of rage and desire and complication as we always have been. We might have the tools to address some of these things better, but I still think we're not there yet, are we? I think actually in our society, we are often now talking about what we know is right. And that is good, and that is right, and that is fair. But if we only talk about and show what is right and good, what happens to the bit that I'm talking about, the bit that exists that is not so right and not so good and a little bit animal still? Do we just repress that, and does that just make anger, and does that now then just make more psychological damage? Do we need to see people behaving badly and going through their moments of grief and rage at their own self-deception and mistakes and come out the other side of it and either find forgiveness or a sense of wisdom from those mistakes? But I will always stand by this play for the fact that it does that. It puts these people through the mill. It pummels them. It puts them in terrible situations. It sees them act badly, really badly, but it also sees them have wisdom and really bold attempts of genuine connect. I mean, I think the most romantic line in British literature exists within this play is the line, "Wear a battered cardigan on the beach in Bournemouth." I mean, isn't that what everyone wants to hear? It's not about any of the trappings, any of the stuff. It's just about wearing a shitty cardigan on Bournemouth Beach, which isn't very romantic, but I'd still love you.
Yeah, so it's a reminder of what we have learned in the time since this has gone on, but what we also continue to need to learn.
I think so. And also maybe, be better. Try and be better. Maybe we do still have these desires and we are going to betray and be awful but God, maybe, fail better.
That's a good one. Let's carry on failing better. That's my motto. Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is that I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might talk about, or it's just a personal favorite. So I know you could have many, but what about one?
One. Okay, one would be The Pillowman by Martin McDonagh. This is the next one I want to do, out of interest.
Oh, great.
Yes, I had such a wonderful time with my lighting and sound designer. They made the play with me. We were absolute collaborators. And so we've all said to each other, okay, what next for all of us if we were to go on? And we've all said this would be the one, The Pillowman by Martin McDonagh. So I wish next year or the year after to be on here talking about The Pillowman by Martin McDonagh.
Well, I'll come and ask you. That's a brutal piece.
It is.
But a great one. Thank you for that suggestion, and I will look forward to the production and to coming back and talking to you. Thanks so much, Claire.
Thank you so much.
As the curtain falls on the three remaining characters, what does the blank canvas of their futures, and in particular their future relationships, look like? Have they learned enough to change, to find more stable and happy partnerships, to be able to reconcile the sometimes contradictory pulls of faithfulness and desire, security and danger, constancy and change, familiarity and variety, to understand that what might be best for ourselves could also coincide or come from what is good for others, for those we think we love or are close to. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at ThePlayPod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.